Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. The Russo-Ukrainian war remains the major challenge to the European and one of the major challenges to the world stability. While the Ukrainian army managed to hold Russia's full-scale invasion for the third year in a row and even occupies parts of the Russian sovereign territory in Kursk region, in the West, many politicians seem not to understand what is going on and do not believe in Ukraine's victory anymore. Often, these are the same politicians who believed that Russia would be able to occupy Ukraine in 3 days. But jokes aside, does it seem that the West has a serious problem of understanding Ukraine? What is the source of this problem and how can it be solved? To discuss this, we have invited Darin Gerdes, who is a managemental professor and a host of Professor Gerdes Explains YouTube podcast. Welcome, Darin.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for what you're doing and for your time. And for those who have not subscribed yet to Darin Gerdes' podcast on YouTube, please do it right now. The link is in the description of this video. And of course, don't forget to like, to share, and subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this. But your podcast deals a lot with explanation of basic mechanics of this war and how things look like in reality, not in the fantasy world of politicians who have never been to neither to Ukraine nor to Russia. Today, we have a lot of discussion about Putin's red lines and nuclear threats and escalation. What does the West understand wrong in this Russia's rhetoric?
They have gotten it continually wrong. If they had gotten it right, we wouldn't continue to see the escalating red lines time after time after time. And so I was just on UATV a little bit ago talking about this very point where if Biden truly understood this, see Biden, for example, and it's not just Biden because there are other figures as well, but let me use him since I'm an American. If Biden thinks about what Putin would do based on how he thinks about how he would do things, and he has this knee-jerk reaction away from escalating, like he wants to not escalate, but that's not how Putin thinks at all. And if he understood his opponent properly, he would do exactly the opposite of what he's doing. He would give them more, he would lean in, he would push harder rather than worry about how Putin might escalate further.
Absolutely. And we know every time Putin threatened with escalation, when the West really pushed, or Ukraine really pushed, nothing happened. Strikes on the Crimea Bridge, nothing happened. Strikes on Russian airfields in Crimea, nothing happened. Ukrainian incursion, of course, nothing happened again. Like Russian media just don't talk about it, tries to hide this from the Russians. And still in the West, and as a German, like I prepare to bash my Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, they're just afraid of the red lines, which, as you said absolutely correctly, they would have not let to cross, but not Putin. But what is the escalation free space for Putin? What can he really do? Does he have any escalation free room?
And that's a really good question. We know that he doesn't. If he did, wouldn't Kursk have been the biggest retaliatory? The thing that you would retaliate for most when your own land has been invaded. But he doesn't think of it like, well, they've invaded my land. He thinks of all of it as his land already, and so I think you just have to understand where he's coming from. And honestly, I question what kind of state. So the threat is sometimes worse than the action, because you can keep threatening nuclear stuff again and again and again and back people off. So so he keeps threatening and getting the same result because he keeps doing the same thing, and a host of people go with him. Now Britain's ready to buck that trend, but Scholz certainly wouldn't, at least not without Biden. Right. Well, once Biden goes along, then Scholz is under a little bit of an umbrella. Well, he's already doing it, so we're going to do it. But Putin is successfully deterring Biden. I mean, that's really what this amounts to. And he has successfully deterred Biden to the cost of thousands of Ukrainians since the beginning of this war. What would I like? So, okay, we got it wrong in the first 3 days, and you were talking about how we thought it was a 3 day or 3 week war or whatever. Okay, if you can get it wrong at first, but 31 months later, you should understand what the Ukrainians are capable of and provide them with the tools to get there. I don't think they have any intent to provide that, because I think they're looking to, after the war, what will happen on the other side of this, what the reset will be like. And I could be totally wrong about that, but they don't want to escalate, and they want to look toward on the other side what it's going to be like.
That is exactly what I have an impression from my government in Germany. It looks like they are more concerned about how they will deal with Russia and with Russian businesses after this war than about like how can we save Ukrainian lives. And okay, I can understand like Ukraine is not their country. They don't care to a certain extent. They primarily think about the German lives and the German people, but Putin is openly threatens Germany, and do you think really that they will stop in Ukraine? No. So it's in our German interest to defeat Russia as long as they are fighting in Ukraine against Ukrainians, without waiting to the day when Russian missiles will be dropped on German cities.
So I think you have uh, an authoritarian leader who only becomes more aggressive when he gets what he wants. Bullies are just like this, right? A bully doesn't pick on the biggest, toughest football player. I'd say rugby player, I guess in your case, or like big athlete. They pick on the wimpy guy in the corner of the playground. That's what bullies do, and so Putin thought he could just roll over Ukraine because his advisors, because in an authoritarian system, his advisors are lying to him all the way up the food chain, because one's lying to his boss, lying to his boss, lying, and it gets embellished all the way up. And so he thought that it was going to be that Ukraine was the wimpy kid. Turns out the wimpy kid in the corner was working out for the last, 10 years and 8 years since 2014, and it wasn't going to be that easy of a fight. And so he's embroiled in something that he didn't want to get embroiled in, but now he's, like, I think if Putin knew from where he is right now and could go back in time, I think he wouldn't have done what he did. But now he's in, and he's got to be all in, because there's no path forward for him personally other than victory, and that victory's not going to come. So he has to continue to maintain the war. Like the way forward for him is just to continue to keep this going and just keep throwing men and material at it. And he's got plenty of men. You fight with what you've got, and he can just keep regenerating more men to go into the fight. And he's going to do it quietly. October 1st, I believe, is the new cycle of mobilization, when that cycle begins for them. And they have to replace 380,000, was it, or something, 300 some odd thousand from the last 1 year, 1 calendar year. And then another, it's more than that. And then another 180,000 to get their new numbers. They have to get north of 500,000 when it's all said and done. And so it'll be interesting to see how he tries to mobilize without really disturbing his population. And his population's disturbed, but he doesn't want to push it too hard or too much, and that's going to be challenging for him.
That is absolutely what problem Russia is facing. They have first started the first wave of mobilization in October 22. Then they faced a huge exodus of young Russians out of Russia, mostly from rich regions like Moscow, Petersburg. But then the Russians have realized that the rich cities are not affected by mobilization. Only poor provincial towns get affected. So it's not a huge problem in Russia until now, but maybe still in the next waves of mobilization, they will reach the limits of their capacities. But what I wanted to ask you, you are a professor of management, and we clearly see that this war, like any other war, is a war of economies. And on the Ukrainian side, you see a lot of crowdfunding, a lot of campaigns, a lot of grassroots initiatives, assembling drones, developing drones, delivering equipment to the army. On the Russian side, it seems to be more of centralized, more relying on huge companies, the cooperation with Iran, with North Korea. What can this war tell us about management of the war?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, I think the big lesson, now there is a little bit of the crowdfunding kind of thing within Russia of, wives and girlfriends of the soldiers, collecting stuff, but it's very small. But the real overarching lesson here is that if Europe and the NATO alliance can hold together, you can't really beat it. If they fracture, and Putin's doing everything he can to fracture it, he can win, right? Like he can win if he can drive such wedges between that, and he's trying to do that. Like Orban's been a useful tool for that, trying to drive the United States away from it. That could be a possibility. If he could fracture it, he could win. Now he'd have to sufficiently fracture it to make it stop. Where, okay, well, if they're not paying, then I'm not paying. That would be really bad for Ukraine. I'm not sure that he can do it. But if they hold together, there's no real way that he can win, because you can't use nukes. You really can't. For all his talk about it, he can't do that. The other big thing that I see is that I don't believe the war will be won on the battlefield. The battlefield will only hold, in my estimation, hold long enough until there's a political or economic collapse, some kind of event that causes one side or the other, but I think Russia to stop. It could happen in Ukraine. Ukraine, if their big choke point is manpower as well, and if they can't replenish their supply of soldiers back into the battlefield to be able to hold on long enough to be able to continue, that will be their choke point. But on the Russian side, I think my prediction, if Russia loses, which I think is possible and even likely, if Russia loses, it'll be not because of a battlefield loss, but because some economic trigger and it'll go very quickly, or political trigger and it'll go very quickly. I can't necessarily predict what it will be, but that's how I see things playing out. And that's a very dangerous ground to be in the prediction business. So I'm purely speculating based on everything. I've just passed my 2000th video. So I've been spending a lot of time here since the war began. So I've been spending a lot of time paying attention to this, but that would be how I would see this playing out.
And this is absolutely the choke point for Russian economy, which Ukraine trying to hit the refineries and the export facilities for crude oil and for gas. And it's really interesting, how can Russia survive without these export capacities?
Right. And so when you see the oil being destroyed, and oil and gas are about a third of the Russian economy, right. And you see the overpaying for soldiers. You're at 8% of the Russian GDP right now on cost for paying military personnel. And then you see inflation. I mean, just so many things breaking against them economically that. Now, they're a big place. They can sustain, and they can take a lot of punishment, but it can't go on indefinitely. And so when you see all these factors start to line up, you start to go, there's a pattern here, and it's not going to go well for them the longer this goes on. Things like at what point will they run out of their own tanks or something, those kind of things. And it's not going to be till 2025, 2026, something along those lines, where they'll start to run out of APCs or tanks without having to import. But then that's going to cost. Right, you have to pay for this as opposed to something else, and so it's just, this is a destructive business. It's kind of a race to see who can destroy the other side faster, and that's where they are. But they're very vulnerable. They're far more vulnerable than you would think, because you look at the landmass and you go, wow, Russia's such a big country, but it's big, but that also means that there's a lot of places that Ukraine can hit, and they can't protect everything simultaneously. So it's not in as good shape. And then you add the level of corruption, right, that we just didn't know before the war, and we've been seeing, like, wow, there's been a lot of generals lining their own pockets, deeply corrupt. And so I even wonder about the nuclear capacity, or I hope they've been maintained, but that last missile test the other day shows maybe not. So Russia has significant problems, and we'll see how that all plays out over time.
Absolutely, and we have already seen that missile test you have mentioned with Sarmat missile, RS-28, which has exploded in the silo, and we have seen a lot of other Russian cases of corruption, which practically led to a significant reduction of Russia's power. But this forces me to ask the next question. We see the Russian so-called liberal opposition, which was fighting corruption all the way, and which are still very much afraid of Russia's collapse. And if you ask them who should be defeated in this war, they maybe tell you Putin should be defeated. But they are afraid of talking of Russia's military defeat, and they openly criticize anyone who mentions the future possible collapse of Russia. Um, what is there for the motives in their position, and how can they uh, impact the current war?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much good they would do. Like it's actually odd because some of them would do like Gary Kasparov is the kind of person that has the right answer pretty much all the time. Not always, but pretty much all the time. He's right on. Some of the others I think would actually strengthen a bad system. And that would be problematic. Timothy Snyder of Yale talks about how Russia needs to be beaten. That's the best thing for Russia. If they are beaten, then they stop with the imperial ways. Compare that to Japan after World War II and how they now play nice
Germany.
How Germany after World War II. I was just going to, I for whatever reason, I list Japan before Germany when I give this example. But yes, exactly. Germany after World War II, totally different than World War I and World War II. So they both of these countries shed that imperialistic, militaristic mentality, maybe even too much, where it took a while for Germany to get up to speed. And honestly, I wouldn't have faulted Germany if they've been like, we're going to do everything for humanitarian purposes. We're not going to give any kind of military weapons. We just don't roll that way anymore. And but here's all the ambulances you can possibly have until you're tired of ambulances and gauze. That would have been fine, right? But that was very different only because of the defeat, and Russia needs to be going through that process to transform itself from an imperialist state.
How realistic do you think is the collapse of Russia and its division to independent states?
I don't actually want it to. I don't actually want it to divide or fall apart in that sense. I worry about how it would collapse. I want Ukraine to get their children back. I want them to get reparations. So I want it to hold together at least for that. And then on the other side of that, if they have referendums or something, that doesn't bother me. Like little country that was taken over by Russia once upon a time. Do you want to leave Chechnya? Do you want to leave? All the different groups. That's immaterial to me, but I don't want it to be like warlords fighting with nukes, right? That seems like a bad scene.
Yeah, absolutely. That is what nobody wants. On another hand, as the Soviet Union has collapsed, we have not seen anything like that. Like the nukes were not captured by some warlords, and moreover, like Ukraine has abandoned their nukes to Russia on the Budapest Memorandum, and all wars which started, they were started by Russia on the post-Soviet space.
And that's the big lesson of this war, right? The lesson of the war is if Ukraine wins, it tells the rest of the world, okay, the rest of the world's good and can come to your aid if there's an issue. China's watching this. But if you're a little nation, a little authoritarian dictator somewhere who's just trying to get his hand on nukes because you feel like nukes are the answer, well, nukes kind of are the answer here, because if Russia can blackmail, then then why can't you, right? So how Ukraine goes, the rest of the world will pay attention and take notice, especially China and Taiwan right now, and would-be dictators that want to play Putin's game of blackmailing the world. And if Ukraine wins, a lot goes back to a peaceful state where the rules-based order is more solid. And if Ukraine loses, it becomes very, very bad in many places, as others have taken note.
How sustainable is Ukraine's defense now? Like we know, it is totally dependent on military production of the West, on the support from the US. We have seen it last winter as the ammunition supply 155 shells from the US have been stopped, and how vulnerable Ukraine was. But now Ukraine seems to produce its new its new weapons, including long-range strike drones, including the FPVs, of course, but also the naval drones and other equipment, which cannot totally substitute the Western supply, but which can help Ukraine to fight on their own in certain directions.
And that's what the West is trying to do, is trying to get them to build their, if I'm not mistaken, the West is trying to get them to build their homegrown stuff to hit back as they're going to hit with homegrown things, so that they don't get their hands dirty with it. They'll have Ukrainian blood on their hands just because because people will die in that process, because it's going to take a long time. But I think that's the way that the Biden administration and others are thinking. Hey, let them produce it, let them do it, and then it's them, it's not us. And because they're still looking to the business on the other side of this. So, and that's unfortunate. But Ukrainians have proven remarkably resilient and willing to not just fight, but then to think through things again, and be creative and come up with their. I mean, I have crazy respect for the Ukrainians.
Absolutely, that is everyone who visits Ukraine, who deals with Ukraine, knows how creative and how resilient this nation is, and that is actually a lesson for all us. I've recently heard the statements of the Hungarian foreign minister, who said that if Hungary would have been attacked by Russia, the Hungarians would have never resisted because it makes no sense, and that the resistance from the Ukrainians was a mistake from his point of view.
I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians would just open a corridor if the Russians wanted to. I mean, they would make an agreement. You can use this little strip of land, funnel everything you want into Hungary.
Yes, and for the Ukrainians, it was absolutely impossible to think, how can we surrender? We know what happens to those who surrender to the Russians. We know all the stories of Bucha, Irpin, and other nations. And I think we in Germany and in other European nations, we would have learned much more from the Ukrainians about resilience, creativity, and independency in our actions. Thank you so much. It was an interview with Darin Gerdes, who is a management professor and the host of Professor Gerdes Explains YouTube podcast. If you have not yet subscribed to this podcast, do it right now. You will never regret it. A lot of insights, a lot of very sober analysis. And of course, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. Thank you, Darin, for your amazing insights.